guys. I'm trying to, there we go, that might work. See if I can get it straight so it doesn't look like we're going down the road crooked. Okay, just to pass the time, I'm going to tell a story. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to talk kind of loud. It sounds like I'm yelling. It's just because all I have is the microphone and the phone. So, all right. So we're cruising north. We're on I-35. We're about almost to the Minnesota border, and it's the first real storm that like the upper Midwest has had this year. And of course, I'm coming home dragging the 30-foot Beagle barge behind me on an iffy trailer. Of course, but whatever. Slow and steady wins the race. It's all it counts. Just getting there, living to fight another day. So, okay, I've had this idea for a while. I'll probably put this over on the Yooper-Loper just because most people won't have the time or won't take the time to listen. And it's not a real video anyways. But I had this idea, like a little series called Story Time with Backroads Brenton, and the days before YouTube, because I did a lot of traveling. I've done a lot of traveling my entire life, pretty much ever since I got out of high school on. I've just been like always wanting to be someplace else, and so I've been a lot of places, and even a lot of places overseas. And it was the 90's, remember, it was the 90's. So 90's and early 2000s, back before the world went nuts and all that. So I'm going to tell you guys a story. I've got lots of them. If this series even gets 100 views, I'll just keep doing them. And yeah. So my first one. I have been to Iceland, believe it or not. I've actually been there twice. And the first time was in the winter, and it was kind of on accident, kind of unplanned. And the second time I went in the summer. But I'm going to tell you the story about the first time I went to Iceland, and it was about 1998, I want to say. It was, of course, before 9/11, or what we call here on YouTube 7/11 was a part-time job for all the hobo coders. And what I did was, let's see, in 1998 I was 26 years old. Sounds about right. And probably living in my mom's basement, if she had a basement. It was actually an extra room. Kind of, I went from living in Volkswagen vans to eventually I graduated, up to the big time, moving on up into Toyota vans, and occasionally had an apartment. I never really liked to pay rent. Never been a good worker ant. Went to college too long. Lived on student loans. And, yeah, just kind of that bohemian / bum type, if you depending on what your attitude is about that. But it took me a long time to figure out, what I'm going to do in life. And it's kind of a sidebar to my Iceland story here, but, just to give you some context. I'm going to let this truck pass here. So, yeah, I was like 26 years old, probably, if I had $500 to my name, I felt like I was doing good. It was pretty pathetic in some ways, and also, innocence, the time of innocence. And I decided, I found Ed Burns' books. If you look back on my channel, or if you guys remember, if you've been around a while, if you have, thank you for putting up with me so long. But Ed Burren, my buddy there in Nevada City, California, he's still around. He wrote those books, Vagabonding, and I discovered them in my local library, and they just it was like they were made for me. Like they were written for me. I just couldn't believe it. They're so awesome. If you just go find them. Just Vagabonding. I'll try to put a link in the description. So I used to just pour through them. I knew those books backwards and forwards. I must have read them, 10 times, just studying them. And, Ed made one about Europe, and I'm like, man, I want to go to Europe. in some ways, you know, to give a little more context here, it's like I grew up in Northern California in kind of a small foothills town, and there's, you know, there's a lot of, it's a strange town in the sense of like, there's a lot of hippies, old school hippies that moved up from, you know, San Francisco, Bay Area, you know, old school boomer hippies, you know, from the 60s that kind of like got a little older and decided they're going to continue on with what they do, and so they moved, you know, but didn't want to be in a big crowded city, so a lot of them, you know, ended up in like up the road 180 miles in the foothills, which is much smaller and more beautiful and peaceful, you know, less city, urban. But we also have a lot of rednecks, and, you know, I was probably, I don't know, it's who wants to put labels on themselves, but I definitely, you know, wasn't a hippie exactly, but I just think when that stuff's in the air, you know, your culture, it's like Northern California, just up in the foothills, hippies around, also rednecks and stuff. I've always considered myself kind of like a redneck hippie, because, you know, if you want to use terminology like that, because I kind of have some what would be considered hippie values, and then I also have some redneck values, and I don't really want to pick one camp, because it's my opinion that, like, the powers that be have kind of split the truth in a way, and they did that on purpose. So we're always divided. Everyone's always trying to complete the circle and complete the truth in their lives and get a nice objective view on reality, because it's, you know, and so what they did is they came along and they split the truth. Like, we'll give this side half, the left half, and we'll give the right half, and then they'll forever be trying to complete the circle, and we can politically capitalize on that. And here I go down the philosophical rabbit hole already. So okay, so 1998 or so, and I just got an old backpack, I got an old sleeping bag, I don't even think I had a tent, and $500 probably was as much as I had, but in 1998, $500 was, you know, worth a little more in some ways. I mean, it was worth more, you know, it just went farther. And I planned, you know, and planned for a while, and I finally just, it was like November, and I still didn't know what real winter was back then. I mean, I came to I had a girlfriend in Wisconsin for a year or two, and I lived, you know, out in Wisconsin with her, and I kind of got a taste of what, you know, I'd call real winter, but I was definitely still California, you know, hardcore Californians and Floridans and, you know, Texans and stuff like that never really leave those environments. They just don't, there's no way to know what winter is until you just live in it for a while. So I probably, you know, didn't have flip-flops on, but I just probably had, like, you know, tennis shoes or basic hiking boots or something, and, you know, a jacket and maybe a sweater or something like that. Planned ahead a little bit, and I walked out to Highway 20, which goes through Nevada City, Grass Valley, and Highway 49 and 20 kind of go through there, and I stuck my thumb out, which just literally just like, I'm gonna head east, because Europe is in the general direction of east, you know, when you live in California anyways, it usually always is. And so I stuck my thumb out and I started hitchhiking. Now, it's not the first time I ever hitchhiked. I mean, I probably logged, I figured it out one time, you know, 30,000 miles of hitchhiking miles, you know, back in the day, mostly in the 90s and maybe early 2000s. I kept it going for a little while longer, but definitely in the 90s. I mean, I used to take off, and I've hitchhiked, you know, cross country and different regions and stuff, you know, up the West Coast and down the West Coast and out to the East Coast, you know, at least 2 or 3 times, with little side trips here and there, you know, just for fun. I mean, just to see if I could do it. And I'll tell you, like, I mean, we don't live in the age to really do this anymore, but hitchhiking was a really freeing experience. I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, if anybody listening to this, if you ever did any hitchhiking back in the day, you'll probably, you know what I'm talking about. But, and it's really sad that it's kind of lost its, you know, it's gone. It's of the olden times, but yeah, so I just stuck my thumb out, and I probably, if I remember correctly, got picked up, you know, pretty quick, maybe an hour or two, and I started, you know, heading across country, and I got up into Nevada. I think I got like just east of Reno, and it was, of course, getting colder, and I'm like, oh boy, I'm gonna have to adjust my wardrobe here. And if you guys hear a fan, I have to keep turning on my defrost, so just to let you know. And so I'm out there in Nevada, and I'm like, oh boy, this is gonna, I should have, planned a little better. But I was still okay, and it was still daytime. And I got picked up by this truck driver. It was a woman, and she was black. Just to, give you guys a visual here. She was a black lady truck driver from Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. If I remember correctly. Somewhere back, in the Midwest. And she called herself Chocolate Rose. And that was her CB handle. And she stopped and she, threw the door up and she's like, hey, how you doing? Where you going? I'm going east. And she just kind of, back then, truckers could do this. They there was some loose rules about, don't pick up hitchhikers or whatever, but for the most part, they couldn't enforce it. It was the days before all of the, computers on board and monitoring everything you do from how fast you go. And there's even cameras aimed right at the driver. I mean, literally, if you're a truck driver and 90% of the trucks out there's a camera just right up on the dash, aimed right in your face all the time. It's creepy. It's just a sign of the times, but back in 1998, that definitely was not the case. And so, I'm like, yeah, heck yeah, I'll get a ride. So I jump up, in her cab, and I hadn't really ever been in trucks very much. I think that might have been the first time or one of the only times I've ever been up in a truck. And of course, those big diesel trucks sit up really high. And one thing I remember was the company she was driving for. I still remember this. And the reason why I remember a lot of these details is because I wrote a story about this, and it's actually out online somewhere. I'm just fixing my phone a little bit here. I'll try to find it. I wrote a story about this, and I got it published on a website, early internet website. It was called Boots and All. I'll see if I can find the story. It was called, the story was called America on $10 in a Chocolate Rose, because kind of, moving ahead on the story here a little bit, but I went all the way across the country from the West Coast to the East Coast on $10. And a lot of that was because I got a ride with Chocolate Rose. And so she drove for a trucking company called Klim, K-L-L-M. And the reason why I know that is because every time she would get on her CB, she'd always say, hey Hans, how you doing out there? This is Chocolate Rose on driving for KLLM, Klim. So she said it enough times, it kind of stuck in my head, and I think I wrote it down. And so we start going across country, and she's like, and I'm like, how far are you going? We kind of, you always do this when you're a hitchhiker. You just kind of like feel out what's going on. I got lots of hitchhiking stories. If this series ever goes on long enough, you'll hear some more of them. But excuse me. But so she, we figured out. She's like, yeah, I'll give you a ride. My final destination is, Ohio, and you're going all the way to the East Coast, awesome. And she, she's like, I might even be able to get on the CB as we get closer and find someone that's going all the way to the East Coast. And so I'm like, awesome. And of course, it's going to take, a couple days at least to get to Ohio. And so her truck was set up where she had airlift. She had her seat had airbags underneath it, which when you're in one of these big trucks, I mean, they bounce around a lot, and the only comfortable way to ride for those thousands of miles is to be in one of those seats. It has these airlift bags, so the truck moves underneath you, but the seats stay relatively level. But the passenger seat did not have these bags, and so it was funny because I remember the entire trip I'd look over and we'd be talking, and she'd just be kind of floating up above everything in the cab, and I'd be sitting in this rock hard seat, just bolted securely to the cab, and I'm just bouncing around. And I mean, sometimes we'd hit bumps out there. It would lift me like 6 inches off the seat. It was so funny, like being in a bucking bronco going across country, just bouncing around. But I didn't care. I mean, it's better than standing out there on the side of the road, with your thumb out or a sign, when it's like 20 degrees. And so we for the next couple days, we just 55, 60 miles an hour on most of the interstates, heading back towards Ohio in the general direction of east, which is kind of the general direction I was wanting to go. And we had to do a couple overnighters because truckers can. Most people know this already, but even back then, truckers could only drive for a certain amount of time and distance, and then you have to stop and do this mandatory resting thing because it's probably actually one of those good rules because a lot of people Okay, guys. Well, looks like when I have my phone on the dash, it's right by the defrost vent and it overheated, but that's okay. It cooled back down, so we're back. Okay, so I think where we left off was Chocolate Rose, hurtling towards the East Coast, or actually Ohio, and I'm going to leave out a lot of details here, just try to keep this video, at a manageable length, but let's see. Over the course of a couple days, she had to stop. We'd stay at like truck stops and rest areas, and I slept in the back. The back of the cabs there have a couple of different sleeping quarters, and I just slept on one side and she slept on the other, and there was never anything. Nothing ever happened. I know a person's mind's gonna go there, but no, she wasn't out for any action, so to speak, and I wasn't either, but she was a nice lady, very interesting. I mean, I grew up in a town with like 99.9% white people, and so I never, up to that point for sure, and even some ways to this day, because of just the places I choose to live, never really interacted much with like black culture and black people, and I found her pretty interesting, for a couple days. She grew up in some inner city place, and I think she had a kid or two, and she just decided to become a trucker to make some money, and it probably was one of her best options at the time. I can only imagine. I mean, I probably should have been doing that instead of being a hitchhiking bum, But finally, we made it to Ohio, and it was cold by then. I mean, it was like late November, maybe even early December, and I remember, she got on the horn and she, kept asking her drivers in her company, the Clem drivers, anyone going to the East Coast, anyone to the East Coast? And she finally found a fella. I mean, they always loved, hearing a female voice on the CB. I should mention this too. She'd start talking on there, and, just truckers being truckers or whatever, they'd be like, hey, baby, like, let's meet up at the next pilot, or, whatever they had back then, Flying J's, or, and she's, people coming on to her all the time, and, she had a good sense of humor about it. She probably even enjoyed it. And and she got one of her Clem drivers to say, yeah, I'm going all the way to, New York City or somewhere close to it, and I'll, and she kept, she was really selling me. She's like, I have this rider with me, and he's such a nice kid, nice young man, and he's been nothing but great company for the past couple of days, and I can recommend him. And if there's anybody going to the East Coast, he's safe, and he's just having an adventure, all these nice things. And she got me a ride. This guy came on, I was like, yeah, going to, west or East Coast, and I'll give him a ride. So we met at a truck stop in Ohio, and I jumped, out of her truck, and I might have had to wait, around for a few hours. I can't remember, but it was cold. I mean, I just was not prepared. And I'm checking my load here. And I jumped in this truck of this trucker. He's like, yeah, going all the way to the East Coast. And back then, I mean, I should just try to mention this too for a minute. It's like, it's just human nature. Truckers get lonely out there on the road. Everybody does. And this idea that everything's just too controlled. I mean, people can make the argument of safety until the cows come home. And the only way anyone can ever be truly safe is if you put them in prison. That's really what it comes down to. I think Ron Paul actually said that once. I can legislate and make laws and rules that make everyone perfectly safe. All I have to do is just put everyone in prison. So, I mean, it's the truth. It's the truth, and that's what they're doing. They're always using safety as an excuse. So, but anyway, back in the late 90s, is certainly, who knew back then that was going to be, another golden era. I always say, like, the 90s for me was like what the 60s were for the boomers. It was a decade of freedom. The economy was booming, and we didn't have all the problems that have been created and exacerbated by, the powers that be now. back then. So, and I didn't know any better. I mean, you're just young and dumb, and I didn't know that, things were going to get the way they were, and no one did. So I took a lot of it for granted, and that's okay. I mean, that's just normal, I guess. Anyway, so I rode with this guy. I don't remember as much about that leg of the trip as I do with Chocolate Rose. If I go back and read my story, maybe I can remind myself a few of the details. But he dropped me off, just north of New York City. And back then, you used to be able, in the winter especially, get really cheap airline tickets to Europe from the East Coast. You could, and it was Iceland Air, was what I flew on. And if I remember right, I paid like $190 for a one-way ticket to Europe. I was going to land in Luxembourg, but you have to stop in Reykjavik, Iceland, on the way. So you kind of know where this is probably going. So I flew out of what is the airport in New York City? I think it's JFK. Is one of them out of near New York City. And I remember I had to take public transit. I got dropped off late at night, and I just wanted to get to the airport, because back then you could just get in the airport and you could just kind of lounge around in the waiting rooms as long as you had a ticket going somewhere, and you could live in there for days. I mean, I did. And there's times where I spent 3 days before or after a flight kind of figuring out what I'm going to do, because I know the place to go. And I took the public transit into New York City and to JFK, and back then, New York City never slept. I mean, you could I visited New York City a couple times. I remember, going out on the sidewalks at 2 in the morning, and it's like wall to wall people. You're dodging it, dodging hordes of people, because up until what's going on now, it was just the city that never slept. One of them, And public transportation, goes 24/7. And so I was pretty easy to get on a train. And I got on a bus first. And I remember I was trying to get to a subway terminal to go. That was going to be the easiest way to eventually get into the airport. And I got dropped. I got off a bus in Jamaica, New York. And I had this gigantic, my backpack was pretty big. It was obvious I was kind of living out of my backpack. It wasn't just a little, school backpack. And so, that was a tell about, I was kind of on the road. And I remember I was standing there at a bus line, a bus stop in, a crowded downtown Jamaica, New York. And there was a guy from Eastern Europe. I think he was Polish, if I'm not mistaken. I asked him, I said, you wouldn't happen to know how I can get, what, and he kind of showed me. He didn't understand English very well. But he showed me a map, and kind of, we went over to this old terminal. He's kind of showing me, he was very nice, nicer than, most anyone else there. And I got on another bus, and I remember I sat right behind the bus driver. I'm like, I'm just trying to get to JFK. And he kind of, explained to me what bus to jump on, And I eventually made it to the airport, and I went in. I mean, it was this easy back then. I kind of feel sorry. In fact, I do feel sorry for younger people that might have been born, in the 90s, or I guess at this point even early 2000s, that just don't understand this world that existed before them. And the world was just a lot more free. It was free and innocent and free and easy. And you could just walk into an airport before 7-Eleven was a part-time job, and just buy a ticket on the spot, show them you still had to have a passport, but that's no big deal. Show them a passport, and you just, walk right in, and you just go find a seat, you sit, and, talk to people, and everything was great. And so I bought a ticket on Iceland Air to Luxembourg, and my thought was, when I get to Europe, I'll go hitchhike around, and I was going to go teach English, which I did, actually. I can't remember if I did on this trip. I don't think I did. I think I'll get to that, if I get to that. And so I hung around the airport for a day or two. I finally got my flight, and we had a layover in Reykjavik, Iceland. And I got off the plane, because you have to transfer planes, or we might have had a layover, a short layover. And I sat next to this woman on the flight from Iceland. She was Icelandic, and she kept saying like, "Oh, Iceland's great," and people always just go right past Iceland, but it's a great place, and And I remember, seeing a few articles about it, and how beautiful the women were, and they are. Trust me. If you want to see, if you like, who doesn't, like Nordic-looking women, with blonde hair and beautiful facial structures and blue eyes, and there's a theory behind this of why Icelandic people are, kind of look the way they do, is because the Vikings basically went on raiding missions all over Europe, and they would just kill everybody, but they would steal what they would consider to be the best looking women and bring them back to Iceland and kind of drop them on the beach and say, you got two choices. You can either freeze to death or you can become our wives and bear children and stuff. And there's actually a lot of truth to that. I mean, it sounds barbaric and it sounds certainly not politically correct, but it's the truth. And, look into it. I've looked into it, and it's true. So there's like a gene pool in Iceland that's just incredible in a way. And the women are gorgeous everywhere you look. I mean, it's like you go to a coffee shop and the woman behind the counter looks like a model, and it stands out. You go to a grocery store or a little convenience store or something to buy some haggis or whatever, and the women are gorgeous. They could, if they were living in like a major metropolitan area, they would have modeling contracts. That's how beautiful they are. Not all of them, of course, but a large portion of them. And I'm sure the men, are these good-looking, strapping, tall, blonde, Nordic type looking men too. In fact, I know they are, but red-blooded straight males don't really pay that much attention to that. But it's true. Their male cohorts are just as genetically superior to everybody else as their women are. So just kind of goes with the territory. So I got off it's actually Keflavik is where the airport is in Iceland. It's a U.S. base, if I'm not mistaken. Still is. And it's like, 20 miles south down this little peninsula from Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland. And it's roughly where, last time I checked, where half of Icelandic population is. Iceland has, if I'm not mistaken, I'm taking a guess here, but 500,000 people live in Iceland. And, half or more live in Reykjavik. It's like most parts of the world, except for it's really accentuated by just how the small population in the small place, Most people gravitate towards some one major metropolitan area. And I just left. I just got my bag and I walked out the doors. It was winter. It was 5 a.m. It was cold. And there was a taxi that was going back up to Reykjavik, and he first thought I was, gonna hire him, and I just said, no, I'm gonna hitchhike up there, and he said, oh, go ahead and get in. I jumped in the taxi. He was heading home anyways. And I remember as I was leaving, over the loudspeakers in the airport, because I was loitering a little bit, kind of debating whether to do this or not. And I remember them saying, this thick Icelandic accent over the loudspeakers in the small airports, they're saying, Brenton Nets, your plane is leaving Terminal 3, Brenton Nets. I'm doing a terrible accent. I mean, it sounds like I'm doing a bad German accent, but it's kind of like that. And they were like, they did a head count and they kind of figured it out. And I was the only one that was not on the ongoing plane to Luxembourg. And I just jumped out. And I just left and I grabbed a free taxi. I went up to Reykjavik and I jumped out, and it was starting to get light. And I mean, by this point, I only had $250, $300 to my name, and not really good winter gear. If I ever did this again, or if I was smart back then, I would have had a snowsuit and great boots and a 15 below sleeping bag and the works. I mean, you can pretty much survive anything if you got the right gear, and I didn't. And I started walking around the city, and I was getting tired. I mean, I had been on the road for a week by then, not getting proper sleep and stuff. And I found this abandoned house right on the edge of an industrial area, but it was a beautiful area. It's not there now, I'm sure. It's been gentrified. But this little house was, you know, I crawled through one of the windows, or maybe a side door was kind of partially boarded up, and I kind of pried it open and went inside. And I went upstairs and I found this little room. And there were, I could tell people had been in there before. There was like candles and, you know, maybe a blanket and a little bit of graffiti, this and that. But, you know, it was abandoned. It was truly abandoned. And I just set up my camp in there. I put my mat down in a corner, and I put my sleeping bag out, and I remember I could look out the windows and I could see this port area with these boats and stuff. It was beautiful. I mean, I should have stayed longer, but I ended up staying in that room, and I lit the candles, and I was able to get the room I was in, you know, relatively warm, you know, like above freezing, and I could sit in there, you know, with my jacket on and everything and not be uncomfortable. And I based myself out of that little house for about, I want to say 3 or 4 days of just walking around the city during the day, Reykjavik, and everything is super expensive up there, and so I didn't spend a lot of money. I remember going into the little, you know, corner grocery store type things, and I would get the cheapest thing I could find, you know, some kind of local dish, and I would, you know, that would be my meal for the day, and I was trying to not spend any money. And then I decided to leave. I should have just stayed. I mean, I could have just stayed. When I went back in the summer, you know, when I tell that story, I'll tell you a little more. But I ended up going back to the airport. I got a ride back down to the airport, Keflavik, and I just walked in, and I showed them my ongoing ticket, and they're like, I just hoped I'd get away with it, and they ran it through. They're like, you know, this left like 4 days ago. You know, and I said, yeah, I'm sorry, I missed my flight, and they were just kind of talking to each other in Icelandic, and they just fixed it. They said, okay, we'll put you on the next, you know, plane, because there's lots of seats at that time, and they changed my ticket right there, and then I jumped that next flight going to Luxembourg, and made it to Luxembourg, and that's, I guess, another story for another day. But I'm remembering here that I didn't tell you why the name of the story was America on $10 in a Chocolate Rose. This is actually two different stories. You know, of course, there's the America chapter, and then there's the going on to Iceland chapter, and I just told you both in a nutshell. But I spent that $10 towards the end of the trip when I was riding with Chocolate Rose there. I ended up buying us, I think, sandwiches, if I'm not mistaken, at like a truck stop. I just felt like I should do something, and so I bought these two, you know, $5 sandwiches, and I gave her one, and gave me one. She's like, oh, hon, you didn't have to do that. I get a per diem, and they feed me. You know, I get $20 a day to eat with, and, you know, you didn't have to spend your money, but she took it anyways. And so that was the $10 I spent from Northern California to New York City. And, you know, it was amazing. I didn't even have to spend that at the end of the day. So, different times, different world. In some ways, it was like a lifetime ago. I can't believe it was just me. I was just such a, you know, I don't know. I was a young man that was like on a mission to discover myself, discover America, discover the world. Very innocent and naive, or both, and very lucky. I mean, I often, by the grace of God, I can't believe I'm still here. I mean, right up to this point of like driving on this ice shelf of a freeway in the Midwest in winter, you know, dragging this 30-foot shanty boat. I've kind of always lived my life around the edge like this at times, and I always, for the most part, it always works out. I've had a few, you know, things happen here and there. You know, I had a house burned down once. Maybe I'll tell that story, but yeah, for the most part, I'm very blessed and very lucky, and I'd like to think I have something to do with that, with some praying, and just some, you know, there's like an old saying that says like God looks after, you know, children and drunks, and, you know, I'm not a drunk. I've never been a drunk. I was a child once, but in some ways I was like in suspended maturity, and I was like had childlike qualities for a long time, and maybe some ways I still do. I'm definitely an idealist in some ways, and so I think God just knows your heart, and He'll look after you as long as you have good intentions and you're just trying to make your way in the world in a good way. So that's my thoughts. Okay, guys, I hope this was, if you're still here, you're awesome. Thank you so much. Now, turn the computer off, go do something. I want you to go do it, not listen to me. But hopefully this little story was entertaining, worth listening to, maybe even inspiring, and maybe it, jog back some memories of some, more innocent, simple time in your life too. I'd love to hear about it. Put it in the comment section if you do. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I will catch you later.